The Veil of Isis by Pierre Hadot. Preface. I have been thinking about this book for more than 40 years. Around 1960, I began to be interested in various meanings assumed by the secret of nature in antiquity and in modern times. In the years that followed, I became passionately enthralled by the philosophy of nature, and I wondered if it were possible that a renewal, and no doubt a metamorphosis of this type of research might take place in the contemporary world. Absorbed by my teaching and by other tasks, however, I was never able to devote myself intensely to the study. Nevertheless, in the perspective of the research I was then carrying out on Plotinus, I wrote for the Eranos meetings of 1968 a paper on the contributions of Neoplatonism to the philosophy of nature in the West, in which I was able to present a few ideas that were dear to me. I concentrated especially on the case of Goethe, a poet and at the same time a scholar, who seemed to me to offer the model of an approach to nature that was both scientific and aesthetic. It was on this occasion that I encountered the image and the text that were the starting point for the writing of this work. Let me briefly situate this image and this text within their historical context. From July 16, 1799 to March 7, 1804, the German scholar Alexander von Humboldt, together with the botanist Emil von Plon, had embarked on an extraordinary journey of scientific exploration in South America, whence he had brought back a considerable mass of geographical and ethnographical observations. The first result of these years of discoveries was a communication to the Institute of France in 1805, which was published in 1807 under the title Essai sur la géographie de France. A German version of this work was published in Tübingen in 1807 under the title Ideen zu einer Geographie der Pflanzen, with a dedication to Goethe intended to give public recognition to Humboldt's debt to the author of The Metamorphosis of Plants. This dedicatory page was adorned with an engraving made after a drawing the Swedish sculptor Thorvaldsen had conceived to respond to the wishes of the great explorer. This allegorical engraving, which is quite beautiful in itself, is a measure of how distant we are from the spiritual world in which scholars, artists, and poets still lived at the beginning of the 19th century. The allegory was perfectly clear to educated people of this time. It is perfectly obscure for our contemporaries. Who is this nude personage, holding a lyre in his left hand and unveiling with his right hand the statue of a strange goddess? Which goddess is this, with her hands and her fingers spread wide apart, whose chest bears 3 rows of breasts, and the lower part of whose body is enclosed in a tight sheath, adorned with the figures of various animals? Why is Goethe's book, The Metamorphosis of Plants, placed at the statue's feet? Goethe himself sketched an initial answer to these questions when he wrote, A. von Humboldt sent me the translation of his Essay on the Geography of Plants, with a flattering illustration that implies that poetry too might lift the veil of nature. However, the contemporary reader understands this explanation scarcely better than the enigma. Why does Goethe recognize nature in this goddess? Why does this nature have secrets? Why must she be unveiled? Why can poetry accomplish this task? I answered these questions briefly in a lecture given in June 1980 to the Academy of Sciences and Literature of Mainz. That's Mainz. I believe that's in Germany. The notion of the secret of nature must be understood in the perspective of Heraclitus's aphorism, nature loves to hide. The statue unveiled by Apollo, the god of poetry, was a representation of the goddess Nature, who had emerged from a fusion between the figure of Artemis of Ephesus and that of Isis, who, according to an ancient inscription reported by Plutarch, said, No mortal has raised my veil. In that lecture I sketched a brief history of the metaphor of the unveiling of nature. These themes were also the subject of my seminars at the Collège de France during the years 1982 to 83. During the following years, I continued to work on what I consider to be 3 aspects of the same phenomenon: The history of the exegesis of the Heraclitean fragment, the evolution of the notion of the secret of nature, and the figure of Isis in iconography and in literature. This book sets forth the results of that research. It is above all a historical work, which deals especially with the period extending from antiquity to the beginning of the 20th century and traces the evolution of mankind's attitudes towards nature solely from the perspective of the metaphor of unveiling. I must specify, moreover, that I have not dealt with two problems that are linked to the notion of the secret of nature. The first is of a sociological order and refers to esotericism. Not only does nature refuse to be unveiled, but he who thinks he has penetrated her secrets refuses to communicate them. The reader who is interested in this theme should read the remarkable and monumental work by William Emon, Science and the Secrets of Nature, Books of Secrets in Medieval and Early Modern Culture. This book studies in great depth the phenomenon represented, on the one hand, by the numerous books of secrets that flourished in the Middle Ages and at the beginning of modern times, and on the other, the academies which in Italy, France, and England united scholars in the search for the secrets of nature. This historical phenomenon played a major role in the birth of modern science. From the sociological perspective, one can also read the essay by Carlo Ginzburg, High and Low, the theme of forbidden knowledge in the 16th and 17th centuries. The second aspect is the psychological and psychoanalytical one implied in the representation of the unveiling of a feminine figure, Isis, who symbolizes nature. Since I lack the necessary medical and psychoanalytical training, I have contented myself with alluding to this question in the chapter devoted to Nietzsche. This problem has been dealt with from a feminist perspective by Carolyn Merchant in The Death of Nature, Woman, Ecology, and the Scientific Revolution. This work is invaluable because of its vast range of information and its intense reflection of the destiny of Western civilization. I must also mention an essay by Evelyn Fox Keller, Secrets of God, Nature, and Life. In this book, I have tried to show that in order to explain the concepts and the images that, down to the present day, have served to define the method and ends of the science of nature, we must turn first and foremost to the ancient Greco-Latin tradition. For instance, in a remarkable study on physico-chemical order, Bertrand de Saint-Sernin cites a text by Pascal in which we find the following statement: "The secrets of nature are hidden. Although she always acts, we do not always discover her effects." He comments on this text as follows: "This passage brings to the fore the religious origin of positivism in the theory of knowledge. Indeed, the allusion to the hidden secrets of knowledge recalls the book of Job, where God parades the wonders of creation before Job without unveiling the modes of their fashioning. It is quite true that up to a point we can recognize the religious origins of positivism, insofar as it is an attitude that refuses to go beyond the effects known through the observation of experience, a point I will discuss in Chapter 11. Nevertheless, the expression hidden secrets of nature comes not from Bible but from no other source than Greco-Latin philosophy, in which formulas such as arcana naturae, secreta naturae, or aporheta tes phuseos are frequently used. This will be the subject of Chapter 3. Hans Blumenberg, who is a friend of mine and whose loss I deeply regret, showed in a striking way in his book Paradigmen zu einer Metaphorologie how the history of certain metaphors, many of which cannot be adequately translated into propositions and concepts, for instance, the nakedness of truth, nature as writing and as a book, or the world as a clock, enable us to glimpse the evolution of spiritual attitudes and visions of the world throughout the ages. These traditional metaphors are linked intimately with what are called commonplaces in rhetoric. These are formulas, images, and metaphors adopted by philosophers and writers like prefabricated models, which they think they use freely, but which nevertheless have an influence on their thought. They hold sway for centuries over successive generations like a kind of program to be realized, a task to be accomplished, or an attitude to be assumed, even if, throughout the ages, the meaning given to these sentences, images, and metaphors can be profoundly modified. These ideas, images, and symbols can inspire works of art, poems, philosophical discourse, or the practice of life itself. The present study takes its place within the history of these metaphors and commonplaces, whether in the guise of the formula nature loves to hide, of the notions of veiling and unveiling, or the figure of Isis. These metaphors and images have both expressed and influenced mankind's attitude toward nature. The reader will perhaps be surprised to note that the word nature is sometimes written in this book with a small n and sometimes with a capital N. I have chosen to write it with a capital letter if the word bears a capital letter in a given text that I cite, or again if it obviously designates an entity that is personified or is transcendent in nature, or even a goddess. I thank with all my heart those who have helped me write this book, through the documents they have supplied, the advice they have given, and the corrections they have suggested. In particular, I thank Eric Bigney for his patience and judicious remarks, and Sylvie Simon for the help she contributed. All my gratitude also goes to Katseta Luna, who assisted me with such amiability and efficacy in all the problems raised by the bibliography and the writing of this work. I have also profited from the valuable help of the advice of Monique Alexandra, Véronique Boudin-Milot, Pierre Hadot, Sandra Laugier, Jean-François Ballard, René Bonnet, Louis Franck, Richard Goulet, Dieter Halfinger, Philippe Hoffman, Lucio Ordine, Alain Sivons, Brian Stock, and Jacques Boulier. I express my gratitude to them all. The Veil of Isis. Prologue at Ephesus. An enigmatic saying. Excuse me. Throughout our story, we will recognize three guiding threads woven together. Heraclitus' famous formula, nature loves to hide, and its fortunes throughout the ages, the notion of a secret of nature, and finally the veiled image of nature, represented as Artemis/Isis. The story I'm about to tell, therefore, begins symbolically at Ephesus in Asia Minor around 500 BCE. On the day when tradition reports that Heraclitus, one of the most ancient thinkers of Greece, deposited the book, probably without a title, in which he had summarized all his knowledge, in the temple of the celebrated Artemis of Ephesus. The book contained an enigmatic saying made up of three little Greek words, phusis, kryptestai, philei, which traditionally have been translated by the formula, nature loves to hide, although in all likelihood this meaning never occurred to Heraclitus. Three words that future generations never ceased trying to interpret. They provide us with a glimpse of what may be the beginning of reflection on the mystery of reality, but perhaps also of the end result of a long meditation, come down through the mists of the ages. In this temple at Ephesus there was a statue of Artemis, an idol made of dark wood, adorned with various vestments or ornaments hanging from her neck and chest, the lower part of her body encased in a tight sheath. She too was a strange and enigmatic figure, emerging from prehistory. Throughout the itinerary on which we are about to embark, we shall follow the destinies that became linked on that day, and for millennia to come, between these words and the figure of Artemis, which, as we shall see, became identified with Isis. Step by step, we shall follow the metamorphoses of the theme of the veil and of unveiling, be it the veil of death, of Isis, of the secrets of nature, or of the mystery of being. The three Greek words, phusis, kryptestai, philei, uttered and written by Heraclitus, were always heavy with meaning, heavy with the meaning Heraclitus gave them, and heavy with the meaning future centuries were to believe they discovered in them. For a long time yet, perhaps even forever, they will remain their mystery. Like nature, they love to hide. What did Heraclitus himself mean when he uttered or wrote these words? To speak frankly, this is extremely hard to know, for two reasons. First, Heraclitus's obscurity has been proverbial since antiquity. 2 centuries after him, Aristotle said that no one knew how to punctuate the Ephesian philosopher's text because they could not tell whether a given word belonged to the next clause or to the preceding one. This obscurity was, moreover, one of the features of an ancient wisdom, which loved to express itself in the form of enigmas. In the Protagoras, Plato's seven sages prove their wisdom by the brief and memorable words they offer as first fruits to Apollo in the temple of Delphi. Such is the style of ancient philosophy, says Plato, laconic brevity. Yet Heraclitus did not limit himself to enigmatic conciseness. By this literary form, he also wanted to provide a glimpse of what, for him, is the law of all reality, the battle among contraries and the perpetual metamorphosis that results from this eternal combat between opposing forces. There can therefore be no question of relying on the interpretations that the ancients gave of this obscure text, all the more so because since they are later than Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they are situated in a mental world wholly different from that of the thinker from Ephesus. Language evolves, thought adopts other channels, and the authors of the time, like modern authors, were not even aware of the mistakes they committed. In order to try to understand, we must rather compare Heraclitus with Heraclitus, or at least with authors not too distant from him in time. As far as Heraclitus himself is concerned, the possibilities for comparison are unfortunately very limited. We now possess only 126 fragments of his work, or a dozen pages at the very most. These fragments appear in the form of short sayings or enigmatic aphorisms which tend to adopt an antithetical structure that thereby reflects the very constitution of reality in which contraries coincide. Part 1: The Veil of Death. Chapter 1: Heraclitus's aphorism. What is born tends to disappear. In order to understand Heraclitus's aphorism, we have to try to understand three words. First of all, we can say that this kind of sentence containing the word philiein, which means to love, is often found in Heraclitus himself, but also in the tragedians, or again in Herodotus. For instance, the wind loves is accustomed to blow, or the wind loves or is accustomed to blow. So the wind loves to blow, or the wind is accustomed to blow. Or in Democritus, thanks to these exercises, in parentheses, the efforts at learning reading and music, respect loves to develop, in parentheses, is habitually developed. So in one sense, love can be considered to be accustomed to something, and then in another respect, love is a habit that is developed. Here the word love, philii, denotes not a feeling, but a natural or habitual tendency, or a process that occurs necessarily or frequently. Yet what is the subject of which it is said that it has a tendency to hide, or that it habitually hides? It is phusis, a word that had a wealth of meaning in Heraclitus's time, but certainly did not mean nature as a whole, or as the principle of phenomena. At the time it had primarily two meanings. On the one hand, it could mean the constitution of proper nature of each thing, and on the other, a thing's process of realization, genesis, appearance, or growth. The first meaning is attested in Heraclitus. He declares, for instance, that his own method consists in dividing each thing in accordance with its nature. From the perspective of Heraclitus's doctrine, this may mean to divide each thing while revealing with it the coincidence of contraries that is proper to it. If we understand phusis in this sense, we could suppose that to hide refers to the difficulty of discovering the proper nature of each thing. In Heraclitus, the words kryptein or kryptesthai can have the meaning of to hide from knowledge, for instance with regard to Apollo at Delphi. His discourse neither states nor hides, but indicates. The meaning of our aphorism might thus quite possibly be the following. Nature, in the sense of the proper constitution, proper force, or life of a thing, loves to hide, or not to be apparent. This interpretation, moreover, would allow two nuances. Either the nature of things is hard to understand, or else the nature of things demands to be hidden, that is, the sage must hide it. We can legitimately wonder, however, if we ought not rather understand phusis here in the second sense, that of a process, that is, in the sense of the appearance of birth or of a thing and of things, the appearance or birth of a thing and of things. This meaning existed in Heraclitus' time, and the best example is found in Empedocles. There is absolutely no birth, or physis, for all mortal things, nor end in detested death, but there is only mixture and distinction of mixed up things, and this is what men call physis. Empedocles means that if people believe the word physis designates the process whereby a thing begins to exist, they are wrong. Physis is a process of mixture and distinction of pre-existing things. However the problem raised by Empedocles should be solved, it is clear that the word physis means the process by which things appear. Heraclitus's aphorism might then mean, the process of birth and formation tends to hide itself. We would still be within the register of the difficulty of knowledge, and we could compare our aphorism with another aphorism by Heraclitus. The limits of the soul, as you go on your way, you could not find, even if you explored all paths, so deep is the Logos. We could deduce from the comparison of the two sayings that physis is identical to Logos, that is, to the breath that unites contraries. Nevertheless, it seems we must ultimately interpret kryptosthai in a wholly different sense, either in its active form kryptein or in its middle form kryptosthai. This verb, like the verb kaluptein, can signify to bury. Calypso, the famous nymph who detained Odysseus, is she who hides, that is, the goddess of death. This meaning corresponds to the representation both of the earth that hides the body and of the veil with which the heads of the dead are covered. In Euripides' Hippolytus, for instance, Phaedra, horrified by the passion devouring her, asks her nurse to conceal her head. The nurse obeys but adds, I veil you, but when will death cover my body? Death thus appears here as a veil, a darkness, or a cloud. This possible meaning of kryptein, kryptein, kryptosthai can orient us toward another interpretation of the Heraclitean fragment. We have just seen that the word physis could designate birth, while the word kryptosthai, for its part, could evoke disappearance or death. We would thus have an opposition between birth and death, appearance and disappearance, and the saying would take on an antithetical turn, in complete agreement with Heraclitus' overall spirit. Here again, we would have two possible forms of the antithesis. First, we could suppose that physis and kryptosthai, with this verb being taken in the middle voice, are to be understood in an active sense. This would give us the following meaning. What causes birth also tends to cause disappearance. In other words, it is the same force that causes birth and makes things disappear. Yet we can also allow the two words to have a passive sense. As in Aristotle, the word physis could designate the result of the process of formation, and thus the form that appears at the end of the process of formation. Our aphorism would then mean that which results from the process of birth tends to disappear, or the form that appears tends to disappear. I have now mentioned five possible translations of the enigmatic saying, which shows how difficult it is to understand Heraclitus. The constitution of each thing tends to hide, for example, or for example, is hard to know. The constitution of each thing wants to be hidden, i.e., does not want to be revealed. The origin tends to hide itself, i.e., the origin of things is hard to know. What causes things to appear tends to make them disappear, i.e., what causes birth tends to cause death. Form or appearance tends to disappear, i.e., what is born wants to die. The last two translations are probably closest to what Heraclitus meant, since they have the antithetical character that is typical of his thought. Reality is such that within each thing there are two aspects that destroy each other mutually. For instance, death is life and life is death. Immortals, mortals, mortals, immortals. For the ones live the death of the latter, and others die the life of the former. Once they are born, they want to live, and thus they have the fate of death, and they leave children behind them so that still more fates of death may be produced. The name of the bow is life. Bios. The name of the bow is life. I think it's saying the Greek word for bow, as in bow and arrow, is bios, and it's the same root of the Latin biological, but its work is death. We find this link, for instance, between birth and death, appearance and disappearance, in a famous passage from Sophocles' Ajax, which has sometimes been called the Discourse of Dissimulation. Ajax has previously announced his intention to die. Suddenly, at the moment when the chorus has already begun its lament, he declaims a long speech which gives the impression that he has changed his mind. His speech begins, "Yea, great time, uncountable, makes all things appear," in parentheses, "huiae," that were not apparent, in parentheses, adela, and once they have appeared, in parentheses, phanenta, it makes them disappear, kruptetai. Nothing, therefore, is unexpected, but dread, oath, and the hardest mind are conquered. For I, too, once so steadfast, now feel my words are becoming effeminate. The image of time the revealer was to live on in the rich theme of the truth revealed by time. The theme of destructive time is a remarkably fertile commonplace, of which I shall give only the example of a verse by Shakespeare, who addresses time as follows: "Thou nursest all, and murderest all that are." Some authors have already pointed out the kinship between this passage with Sophocles and the aphorisms of Heraclitus, particularly the one that mentions aeon, in parentheses, duration or time. Aeon is a child playing dice. To make this comparison, they have relied on a text by Lucian that sums up the whole of Heraclitus's philosophy as follows: "Everything is mixed together. Knowledge, ignorance, large, small, up and down penetrate one another in the game of time." Another word for time is aeon. In fact, it is extremely hard to know what aeon means in Heraclitus. The time of life, cosmic time, destiny. In any case, we cannot know whether aeon, already in Heraclitus' time, had the power of veiling and unveiling attributed to it by Sophocles and Lucian. Be that as it may, it is clear that the image of the game of dice does not appear in Sophocles. It is also unlikely that there is an echo of Heraclitus' fragment 123 in the tragic author, since in our fragment it is physis and not time that makes things appear and disappear. Yet in a way that is very interesting for our subject, Sophocles' verses oppose the two verbs, huiai and kruptetai, thereby encouraging us to retain the two interpretations that I propose. That is, in the active sense. What causes things to appear tends to make them disappear. What causes birth tends to cause death, or what unveils is also what veils. And in the passive sense, what appears tends to disappear, or what is born wants to die. Thus the aphorism expresses astonishment before the mystery of metamorphosis and of the deep identity of life and death. How is it that things are formed only to disappear? How comes it that within each being the process of production is indissolubly a process of destruction, that the very movement of life is the very movement of death, with disappearance seeming to be a necessity inscribed within apparition, or within the very process of the production of things? Marcus Aurelius was to say, "Acquire a method for contemplating how all things are transformed into one another. Observe each thing, and imagine that it is in the process of dissolving, that it is in the midst of transformation, in the process of putrefying and being destroyed." Many poets would echo this view, such as Rilke, who sang "Want transformation," or Princess Bibesco, who meditated on death as she looked at a bouquet of violets. Montaigne had expressed this mystery strikingly: "The first day of your birth sets you on the track of dying as well as of living. The continuous work of your life is to feel death. You are in death when you are in life. Throughout life you are dying." We might re-encounter Heraclitean thought, though there is no question of a direct influence, in certain theories of modern biology. Already Claude Bernard had said, "There are two kinds of seemingly opposite vital phenomena, some of organic renovation, which are as it were hidden, and the others of organic destruction, which are always manifested by the functioning or wearing out of organs." It is the latter that are usually characterized as the phenomena of life, such that what we call life is in reality death. This is why we can say both that life is creation and that life is death. Contemporary biology has considered sex and death, the two important inventions of evolution, to be connected. Francois Jacob has clearly shown the close relation between reproduction through sexuality and the necessity of the disappearance of individuals. Nothing obliged a bacterium, he writes, to practice sexuality in order to multiply itself. As soon as sexuality is obligatory, each genetic program is formed no longer by the exact copy of a single program, but by the matching up of two different ones. The other condition necessary for the very possibility of an evolution is death. Not the death that comes from without as the consequence of some accident, but the death that comes from within as a prescribed necessity, right from the egg through the genetic program. In an article of Le Monde, Jean-Claude Ameisen, by emphasizing the anthropomorphic character of expressions such as cellular suicide or programmed death, called attention to the importance of the fact that at every instant our cells possess the power to destroy themselves within a few hours. In conclusion, we might open a parenthesis on a mistake made by Felix Revison when in his philosophical testament we read, "All nature," says Leonardo da Vinci, "aspires to its death." We have the impression that Leonardo da Vinci had rediscovered the cosmic vision of Heraclitus. It is true that the commentary Ravasson gives should be enough to set us on the right track. This is true in the same sense as that in which St. Paul says, "I wish to be dissolved," in the sense that every day all creatures aspire to that sleep that renews its exhausted strength. In some, it aspires to the final sleep, as the necessary passage to a new life. Such a formulation obviously bears no relation to what Heraclitus meant. What is more serious is that Reveson's formula has absolutely nothing to do with the text of Leonardo da Vinci. First, Leonardo never wrote, "All nature aspires to its death," but rather speaks of force running furiously to its own destruction. In fact, when he mentions the desire of death, Leonardo means to speak not of all nature, but of the force that is necessary, quite prosaically, for firing projectiles. He therefore develops a highly original theory of force, which he defines as a spiritual capacity, an invisible power, which by accidental violence sensible bodies have engendered and implanted within insensible bodies, giving them a semblance of life, and this life is wonderful in its actions, as it violates and modifies the place and form of every created thing, running furiously to its own destruction, and producing in its course effects that are different on each occasion. We can see that Reveson, like many contemporary philosophers when they quote text, has completely deformed Leonardo da Vinci's meaning. As we come to the close of this parenthesis, let us say, to write the history of thought is sometimes to write the history of a series of misinterpretations.